So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our podcast conversation, Women in Leadership Talk. We are speaking with Dr. Rachel Corradetti-Sargeant today, who is a naturopath. Dr. Rachel, thank you so very much for joining us. We're thrilled that you're here today and sharing all your wisdom with us.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. So I'd love to just give a little background quickly on Rachel so that everyone can get a sense of who she is, what her background is. She practices naturopathic medicine. She is part total science nerd, which I love. And I would never classify you as a nerd, just for the record. And part no holds barred health nut. That part, yes, I get, but nerd part I don't get.
I am a nerd.
Yeah.
Very much so.
Well, we're going to find out today.
Yeah.
So during her undergraduate studies in kinesiology at the University of Western Ontario, she learned a number of hormone imbalances and was told that conceiving would likely be a struggle. She worked with a naturopathic doctor to overcome these issues for herself. And it became clear to her that becoming a naturopathic doctor was her destiny. I'm super grateful for that. So she, just to give a little history, her background, she studied at the National College of Natural Medicine in Portland, Oregon, and also the Canadian College of Naturopathic Medicine in Toronto, Ontario. She's licensed through the College of Naturopathic Medicines in Ontario and is a professional member of the Canadian and Ontario Association of Naturopathic Doctors. Somebody says they miss you in Bolton. Me too.
Sorry.
As well as Endocrinology Association of Naturopathic Physicians. And she is licensed to prescribe a small schedule of pharmaceuticals granted to naturopathic doctors, which is an honor from my understanding, right? And administers intravenous vitamin infusion therapy. So Dr. Corradetti, thank you. We're super glad to have you, joining us today. And, that's all the business stuff. But on a personal note, she is a health nut. She's running triathlons. She's wrangling 2 young kids, plus working in 2 different clinics. Like, she is a powerhouse woman doing all of it. So also contributing to, lots of different magazine articles and Clean Eating and Elle magazines. So just as we were joining today, she was sharing that she's also indulging in a baking class where she's going to learn how to do all these amazing dishes. So we're thrilled that you're here and so excited to jump into these burning questions that people have around hormones. So again, we welcome you, and let's jump in and start talking about hormones.
Okay,
awesome. So, when you and I were talking earlier, we were discussing there's hormones range from very young age to, up until later in life. And our bodies go through all these different things. But let's begin in those early years, if you don't mind. So what happens and how do we prepare ourselves to ensure the best possible outcomes when it comes to hormones?
Right. So I think what's really interesting about this particular question, like the younger, what do we do when we're younger, is especially for those parents who are potentially taking care of, people who are coming into the menstrual age. And how can we support them as they go through this journey? Because that is often when hormonal issues will start to develop, if there are going to be some. And so, with my work, I am working at both ends of the spectrum. So I'm working in these early hormonal years into the fertile years. And one of my practices, actually where I am today, is entirely focused on fertility. And on the other side, I work as women transition out of their fertile years. So what I find really interesting is, that when we're in this time of life, when we're in the early phases of working up to, potentially thinking about having children, we need to be aware of what our body is telling us. And it's always telling you something. And so we need to listen. And what has become very common these days is that we don't listen, or we listen and we say, I'd like to turn that off, please. And so we might go to a healthcare provider and the solution will be, okay, well, let's begin an oral contraceptive medication. and we'll just turn everything off. And then we'll just pick up again when you might want to have kids. And so I'm often seeing that in my work where, there have been hormonal issues that have been presenting themselves from a young age, irregularity, acne, painful periods, very heavy periods, things like that. And women have been given the solution of, well, let's just turn it off right now. We'll use an oral contraceptive medication, and then we'll circle back when you want to have kids. And then, they'll come off the pill, and 6 months, a year later, they're wondering, well, why isn't this happening for me? Or why hasn't my period come back? And it's because we may have been masking those issues all along, and now we really have to deal with them.
So, okay. And that's a great point. And, of course, you just took me back to my really young days. I'm so far on the other end of the spectrum now, and I'm grateful for that. But what are some of the things, like, what are some things you can do naturally? I mean, should we just go through the process? Like, I've got a young teenager who's in the height of the acne, the heavy periods, the serious cramping. So do we just work through it, or what are your thoughts on that?
Right. That's a great question. And it's always complicated by the fact that at that age, there will be, a lot of sexual interest developing as well. And we obviously want to be keeping our children safe. We want to be protecting against unwanted or unintended pregnancies, typically at that stage. And so there's always this conversation about, well, what do I do? Because when the body is telling us that something's up with those symptoms, in my job, that tells me something's going on. Like, we need to look, especially if this menstruating person has been having issues for a number of years. For example, their period has come around, when they were 12 or 13, and then by 16, 17, they're still really struggling. Mm-hmm. They've been going through it for long enough now that we really need to be investigating what's going on imaging, what's going on with, with respect to hormone levels at that point. It's not always something that we'll look at very early, but it is something that we can address if it's been a number of years that a person has been menstruating and they're having difficulties. In the earlier days, what we'll often turn to more is, well, how can we support you from a dietary perspective to reduce inflammation? How can we support you from a lifestyle perspective? Especially one of the big ones is circadian rhythms. And that's something that a lot of young women are really impacting these days because of their late night blue light exposure. A lot of teens especially are not turning off their screens at all. One of the colleagues that I work with at my clinic in Burlington, she actually works almost exclusively with teens. And she's been telling me stories about how she has patients of hers who are on TikTok until 3 a.m. No, your hormones are on a cycle. Women in particular run on a 28-day cycle. I put that in brackets because it's not always exactly 28 days, but we run on a cycle, and our circadian cycle is tied in with that. So if there's any interruption with that, it will hugely impact your cycle.
Okay.
But we'll often hark back to those lifestyle, dietary, possible, helpful supplementation options when they're in their very, very young years. But if they're getting later into their teen years and it's really becoming a problem, then we'll do a little bit of deeper investigation.
Okay. Wow, that's interesting. Because I never even associated the blue lights because I happen to have a teenager who wants to be up, and she's, either, she's on social media or she's watching a movie or whatever. That's fascinating. Yeah. Okay. So we'll have to dig into that a little bit more. I did see a hand go up. Mackenzie, did you have a question you wanted to ask? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I was just going to say, it makes so much sense that, I mean, these young women and trying to regulate it in a natural way. But even now, I mean, if I don't get my 8 hours of sleep, or if a weekend is kind of busy and there's late nights and my I'm completely off. So what you just said there, like kind of made, I mean, I always knew that when I stay up late and do these things, but I mean, it's true. Like as soon as you mess with your cycle, it's gonna mess with you right back.
Yeah. So just to build on that, one of the hormones that the body produces as the lights start to dim and as the sun starts to go down is called melatonin, which most of us have heard of before because a lot of people will use it as a sleep aid. We actually, in the fertility world, use it to treat women who have endometriosis, as well as women who are preparing for IVF cycles, because we see better outcomes. And if we circle back to, well, why would those, issues be there in the first place? Like, why might this person be struggling with fertility, or why might a condition like endometriosis develop? We can often go way back and see, well, there's been a lifelong issue with circadian rhythms. And that's why something like melatonin can be so helpful at just resetting.
Oh, wow. Okay. Fascinating. Well, actually, that brings up my next question, because what I was going to ask you is, what are some of the most common challenges that women are facing, regardless of the age or stage? But, where do you see that from? And
right. So if we're,
go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, go ahead. That's perfect.
Yeah. So if we're looking, sort of closer to those early years of fertility, and being in the fertility years or the fertile years, and trying to conceive, some of the things we see coming up over and over and over again, something called polycystic ovarian syndrome is very common, and it's very much an endocrine disorder. So that's impacted heavily by blood sugar levels, as well as by androgen levels. So those are what we typically associate with the male pattern hormones, but females do have those hormones within them too. And it will cause irregular and anovulatory cycles. Endometriosis is another common condition that we'll see quite a bit, where we actually have the endometrial lining of the uterus is actually starting to grow outside of the uterus, and it causes extremely painful and heavy periods. Elevated thyroid antibodies and overall thyroid dysfunction are, that's another common issue that I'll see in my patients as well. And that really spans the ages. If somebody is, entering their perimenopause years, if they have any of these issues that have been going on beforehand, it will almost rear its head in a worse way when the perimenopause years develop.
Fascinating you say that, because I've heard that actually because I'm sort of I'm not perimenopause, I'm full on menopause. But I've heard that from actually several women that are in my age range, where they're either just going into menopause, or they could be the perimenopause, or they're in it, but are having now thyroid issues. And as you know, I've had my own potential challenges with thyroid. So how do we, at a younger age, because I want to stay on that for just a minute, how do we better prepare for those things, or how do we even prevent those things if possible? Like, I know you talked about diet is one, and sugar levels. So what are some other ways that we can impact?
Right. And if we can think about this in a couple of different ways, right? So when I think about it from a fertility perspective, I will often borrow a term from one of my colleagues, who her approach is, well, we should plan for a baby like we plan for a wedding. And so if you've ever planned a wedding before, not that everyone has, but most of us have this idea in our head that a wedding takes a long time to plan, right? Maybe a year. For me personally, it was 2 years. You're doing a lot of work leading up to that. It's no different when you're preparing to bring a new life into the world, right? I mean, we need to make sure that you are a healthy human first before we can go ahead and create another healthy human, right?
Yeah.
And it's no different than when we're entering the perimenopause time as well. So for some women, they maybe didn't have to think too much about it. They easily conceived, really didn't have any issues with that. But then they come to their perimenopause time, and all of a sudden, a lot of things are developing, right? So if we want that journey to be smooth, and the perimenopause journey can last in some cases for 10 years, that's a long time. You don't want to be suffering for 10 years. So we really should be doing a thorough evaluation to determine what could impact you as you're going into this experience. What can we work on now so that this is going to be overall a gentle transition? Because it is a normal experience. We're not supposed to stay, fertile forever. But there can be a lot of things that impact it, and we do want to make it easier.
Yeah. Well, let's jump into that because, you know, those of us that are my age, like I watched my mother go through menopause, right? And she severely struggled. But, you know, I'll bring up some of even my own issues. Like when you get to menopause, it's the weight gain, it's the, you know, you can't sleep, it's the night sweats, the hot flashes, like all of those things that, you know, we all encounter. It's normal, but it's, you know, what are some of the I guess the ways that we can balance that out a little bit more so that it's not, and I'm saying this, I know you work with me on balancing it out, but I want to share that with our audience because, you know, sometimes you think, what can I do? There's nothing I can do. It's just normal, but there are things that we can do.
Oh, absolutely. And I think you bring up an interesting point there where there is often the approach with the menopause experience that, well, this is just how it is. And I can't tell you the number of times that I've had, you know, a patient sit in my office and tell me, I spoke with my doctor about what I'm going through, and the response was, you're getting old.
Yeah.
This is normal. What can we do? Do you want me to give you an antidepressant? And that's kind of where it ends. And so, you know, when a person sits with me and initially, and when we first connect, they'll be spending 75 minutes with me. It's a long time. We will have the opportunity to really hear the symptoms and then to understand where we might need to be making some adjustments. And so I just want to clarify that, yes, it's a normal experience to go through the transition. It doesn't have to be an experience where you suffer greatly. Will there be some potential discomfort? Sure, but that's telling us maybe we need to look deeper at another way to support you. And I think another thing that's important to remember is, you know, we are in a very different time of our evolution as a species. So if we think back, not even that long ago, women weren't living this long, right?
Yeah,
So true. A lot of women were coming to the time in their life where their period was no longer happening. They were going through menopause. They were in their menopause years. They might not be living that much longer afterwards. We have a lot of technology at our disposal now when it comes to healthcare, and we're living, my goodness, there's a lady on my street who yesterday turned 100, right?
Yay! Oh, beautiful.
It's amazing, right? That's amazing. But we need those to be quality years.
Yeah.
And if you're suffering, you're not going to feel good. So we need to address that. And so when we look at, you know, what are we going to look at first of all, and then what are we going to do about it? So we're always taking a look at what's going on hormone wise. So we'll just do normal hormone blood work. It's nothing fancy. We'll take a look at, you know, and when I say hormones, I'm not just stopping specifically at the sex hormones, right? So yes, sure, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, DHEA, sure, we'll check all of those things. But what about your thyroid? That, you know, those are thyroid hormones are very important as well. What about insulin? That's another hormone that's involved in blood sugar management. Let's take a look at that. You know, we'll look at everything as well as nutrients. I always like to have a glance at what's going on with basic nutrients, because if there are any issues, even at that basic nutrient level, you're not going to feel good. Mm-hmm. So maybe if we work on that, you might feel a little better, and all of the other things don't present themselves as intensely. Mm-hmm. We're going to take a look at diet. We're going to take a look at lifestyle pieces. And, you know, I give homework. You have to be willing to work.
Darn.
Better, right? And so some of the more advanced options include botanical medicine. So that is part of the training of a naturopathic doctor practicing in North America, is we have 4 years of training on botanical medicine. And so there are great plant options for managing a lot of menopause symptoms. So you might hear women talk about things like black cohosh or sage or chaste tree or wild yam. We have a lot of options there that we can utilize. And then generally coming to the end of our, you know, spectrum of options, you know, lifestyle through to the most advanced is where we're looking at options like bioidentical, hormone replacement therapy, which is not the same therapy as the original hormone replacement therapy that was introduced in the mid 1900s.
Okay. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because like, I think back to when my mother, like when she was going through menopause and they put her on very synthetic
Right.
drugs. And I mean, she almost had a nervous breakdown, to be quite honest with you. And
Mm.
so that's made me more leery, which is why I came to you as well to help me do it a very natural way.
Mhm.
But maybe talk to us about, what are some of those options and differences, because everybody has a choice, right? And you're going to pick what works best for you.
Mhm.
So maybe talk about that a little bit.
Sure. And so this particular area, so bioidentical hormone replacement therapy, is one of the it's part of the prescribing schedule of naturopathic doctors in Ontario. So we are able to prescribe some pharmaceuticals, and this is one of those areas. Not every naturopathic doctor can do it. You have to have a prescribing license in order to prescribe. So we're looking at bioidentical progesterone, bioidentical estrogen. Naturopathic doctors in Ontario can't prescribe bioidentical DHEA or testosterone, but we can refer out when those options are needed so that patients are well taken care of. And so these particular therapies are very different from what was utilized back in the mid 1950s. So those were synthetic, they were very strong.
Mhm.
Often estrogen was being used unopposed. So what that means is women were being given estrogen without any progesterone to oppose it. And so we were starting to see the development of cancers. And so what the phase that we're in now with hormone replacement therapy is very different. It's very gentle. It's bioidentical. We start low and slow. We do a lot of what I call cover your ass stuff before we even prescribe it. What's going on with your uterus? Do you have any growths there? What's going on with your breast tissue? Do we have any growths there? If you do, well, maybe we're not going to give you estrogen. Maybe we'll stick with something else instead. So we're doing this in a very gentle and safe way. And I have to say, it is something that I feel very privileged to be able to offer my patients, because I know a lot of family doctors are trying to manage these things and don't have the training necessarily to do that all of the time. So they don't know what to do for their patients.
Very true. Well, my own doctor, I mean, he said that from the beginning. He was like, that is not my specialty, and let's make sure you're with the right person. And I've had other health challenges. So for me, natural was I felt the best option for myself personally. Um, so that's great. And it's important, I think, for women to recognize that there are many options, regardless, again, whether you're, looking to have a child, build a family, or if you're on the other end of the spectrum, knowing that there's different ways that you can address and support your body in a way that is healthy. And so that's one of the things I want us to talk about too is, how do I want to word this? We are programmed really not to talk about our bodies, right? Like it's kind of a taboo subject, or at least it was in my years growing up. Like I try and talk to my daughter about it, and she goes, "Mom, I'm not talking to you," right? Like, so we've gone from one extreme to the other where I'm very open, and I guess how do we get better at talking about our bodies and some of the things that we're facing, because we usually shy away or hide from it because we think, oh, something must be wrong with us.
Right. And so I think that is an interesting point to bring up for sure. And I would say that if you don't want to talk about it openly with others, I know that in some families and in some cultures that is not supported. You don't talk about what's going on with, especially if it's more of what we would call like a female complaint. You just don't. So fine, but then you want to be listening to what your body's telling you and sharing it with a healthcare provider whom you trust, who you feel is willing to work with you wholly and completely to understand what's going on and what can be done, right? I think if we're talking about the teen years in particular, it's such an awkward time that, they're probably not going to want to have these deep conversations with their parents potentially, or their guardians, or whomever is helping them go through it. I know I didn't really want to talk about it with my mom, even though she probably wanted to talk about it. And so then who can we set those young people up with so that they feel supported? And they're out there. There are healthcare providers who this is what they do.
Wow. Yeah, I just think that one's so important. And, you know, your mom and I've had this conversation before too, about, you know, how we don't, we're not comfortable necessarily, or women in particular, we're not comfortable talking about just our bodies and the experiences that we have, but also, you know, really getting to know your body. I mean, that is so important, because we think again, it's like a taboo subject, right? And it's not taboo.
No.
It's who you are. And so it's, how do we get intimate with ourselves so that we can, you know, really make sure we are preparing ourselves for that long life. Like to your point of your neighbor turning 100 years old, like that is a complete, you know, mind, body, spirit, every aspect of your being has to be at its best in order to achieve that longevity, right?
And I think you bring up two interesting points there that I'd like to speak to. So number one, community, which is a challenge these days for a lot of people. And so virtual connections like this are so important. And it makes me think of, you know, going back to days of the Red Tent. I don't know if anyone's read The Red Tent before. It's a wonderful book.
Okay.
And you don't know that one, Vicki? Oh my goodness.
No.
So great. And so it's all about biblical times and how women actually gathered monthly in the red tent to menstruate together.
Oh, beautiful. Okay.
And they're all sitting together for a week. I know, of course, this brings up some issues like, why do we need to segregate women when they're bleeding? I don't know. That's weird. But at the same time, like, can you imagine the wisdom sharing that was going on in those weeks, right?
Yeah.
And the same type of experience when you know, when someone was pregnant and going through that experience or having children, like there was community. These days we're very segregated. Obviously, the current global issue is not helping that, but even before that, right? Like we are nuclear families now, and we're not necessarily connected. So community, you know, that mind, body, spirit piece, community, support, wisdom, those are the things that we know, even through research, that provide so much happiness and will teach women about their bodies. So yeah, women have no idea. So my one clinic in Burlington, we host a women's collective called the WIL Collective. And so once a month for 10 months, we gather to discuss women's health topics. And we start with menstruation. And the number of women who have no idea what is normal and what the body goes through on a monthly basis. And I know none of us were paying attention in health class when we were teenagers because we were so embarrassed. I get that, right? But, you know, at some point it'll click that we need to learn about these things, and we need to learn about what our body's talking to us about throughout the month, right? So the Red Tent's a great option. Another great book that I really like is, it's called Woman Code by a woman named Alyssa Vitti. And she speaks about the shifts throughout your cycle and what those mean for your productivity. So for example, during your menstrual period, it's generally a time of, you know, turning inward, rest. You might not want to be having the hardest workouts of your life at that time. As you work toward your ovulatory phase, you are in this like build phase. So you're like more present, you're more attractive, you're more energetic. And then as you work towards your luteal phase, where, you know, we may or may not be supporting a pregnancy, then, you know, this is like a time of like reflection, GSD, like getting shit done, pardon my language. And so it's really interesting to think about that, like what's going on a hormonal level throughout the month. How can you harness that for your own productivity? Kate Northrup is another woman who speaks very much to that. She has a book called Do Less, which is very much about this. And if you're not a woman who is menstruating any longer, you can still follow that same cycle by following the moon cycle, which sounds so crazy, but
it's so true. Yeah, no, I love that. Oh my gosh, that's wonderful. And you're so right. Like when you're young, you're sitting in health class and it's co-ed and you're going, I don't want to know. I don't even want to talk about this. And the boys are going, oh, gross, you know.
Like those images and everything, like the cross sections of anatomy, nobody wants to see that.
Exactly. It's so embarrassing. And well, you know, I can imagine like as I was sharing my daughter, even if I talk about it with her, she's like, oh my God, I just can't have this conversation. My son was completely opposite. He wanted to know everything. And we had very open dialogue around it.
Right.
And, it was, and so I was surprised when she was so resistant to having these conversations, but
Yeah.
I love what you've just described there, because I've always believed in the moon, right? And how there's definitely patterns that happen, and you see it even when your kids are little, and see it in yourself, like there's a whole different energy level that takes place.
Yeah. I'm always fearful of the full moon in my house.
Exactly.
I know somebody's going to have a meltdown.
It's so true. And so when you just said that about how it relates to our bodies and hormonally what we're going through, that makes a world of sense to me. So thank you. That's a great share.
And for going back to the conversation about like teens and specifically, teen girls, trying to meet them where they are. So I know for myself personally, on my Instagram channels, I try to talk about periods as much as I can, so that if anyone's coming across my content, they're like, oh, this is normal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
But they're great books. Sorry.
I said it should be normal, because it's life. It's just what we go through.
Yeah. There are 2 other great books I'll give as resources. So the Period Repair Manual by a naturopathic doctor from Australia named Lara Bryden. That's a really wonderful one. And she has another one that she just released. I think it's called the Hormone Repair Manual, and that's more specifically for perimenopause and menopause. So Lara Bryden is a wealth of knowledge, as is a woman named Lisa Hendrickson Jack, who wrote a book called The Fifth Vital Sign. So it speaks, the level of detail in this book is just magnificent. And she speaks about ovulation in particular being a 5th vital sign. So if you're not ovulating and you're still in your fertile years, there's a problem.
Yeah. Well, and again, that goes back to knowing your body, right? So it is knowing, all the different things that happen or that should be happening for a normal body. And if it's not happening, then you need to get some assistance, right?
Totally. Yeah.
Making sure that you're paying attention to that. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, beautiful. Wow. So so much great information. And I know our audience has some questions, because I had a couple of people reach out, and we had to have somebody dropped off, and she said she's so sorry she can't wait to listen to the rest of the recording.
No problem.
Before we go there, I just want to, give you an opportunity. What would be like your top 3 sort of, being the expert in this, like to help women really get more intimate with their bodies? What would you want to share?
Start tracking. So, we didn't have this technology 15, 20 some odd years ago, but there are so many period tracking apps out there, or even hormone tracking apps if you're not having a period anymore, that you can use to start to track your monthly experience. So that's one thing that I would recommend. So MyFlow, MYFLO is a great app. If you're specifically fertility focused, there's a wonderful app called Kindara, Kindara. So those are some things to look into. And if you don't want to use an app, you can even keep like a calendar, and even just start to tune in with yourself when it comes to like what's going on with the moon. This is especially if you're no longer menstruating. What's going on with the moon, and how am I feeling energetically, and how is that shifting throughout the month? So I would just start to do some tracking and tune in with yourself. Another thing that I highly recommend is please make sure you're getting enough protein. I can't tell you how many times in my day I talk about protein and how many women struggle to get enough. So if you're not getting enough protein, it's going to throw off your blood sugar. You're not going to have enough of those amino acid building blocks that we need to build and repair and maintain tissue. You need it. Women just historically don't get enough. So at minimum, 1 gram per kilogram of body weight is what is required in order to just keep your body going and keep it steady. So that's another big tip for sure that I would want to share with everybody. And then the other one would be harking back to what we discussed with the circadian rhythms piece is please turn off your screens. Your bedroom should be renamed the S room Okay, so you can have snoring in there, you can have snuggling in there. Maybe another S word that I'll use here. What was that one, Vicki?
You can have sex in there.
Right, so that S word is allowed, but the only S that isn't allowed is the screen.
I love it.
None of those. They should not be anywhere near your bedroom. Okay.
Very smart.
So, and like an hour, if you can swing it, an hour before bed, those should be off.
Yeah.
If there's something that's really crucial that needs to get done, please get yourself some blue light blocking glasses. Please install the Flux app onto your desktop so that or your laptop, so it filters out the blue light. Even some of the phones and tablets these days have that option where it'll filter out the blue light, so that we're not, messing with that melatonin production. But keep in mind, whatever's on the screen is still very stimulating, right? So yeah, those are the top three.
Okay, those are great shares. So I just want to piggyback onto your protein comment. Because
yes, Vicki.
Yes. So I would be that patient who, I have a daughter who's vegetarian, and I was, trying to not cook multiple meals. And so I will share with you what Dr. Corradetti is saying is absolute fact-based, because I was eating very little protein and my insulin numbers went crazy, like off the chart crazy. And so Dr. Corradetti has been working with me, along with Tosca, who's on here, between my strike sugar and making sure I'm getting more protein to balance out those numbers. And I couldn't figure it out because, I was gaining weight, but I knew I was gaining weight because of menopause. But then it was also because I wasn't nourishing my body the way it needed. And I think we get confused, right? Because there's so many different diets and stories, and everybody has a different approach, but you really have to know your body. And that protein piece, I can't agree. Like, you've sold me on that, because I feel better. Like, I have more energy, I'm sleeping better. All of the things that you're talking about are coming into natural rhythm because I've strike sugar. I'm in week 6, yay me. And I'm having my protein. So it's important, and that's really why I wanted you to be on here today too, is to share some of these things, because it gets overwhelming sometimes to know what to do. And it's not difficult if we just really listen to our bodies.
Absolutely. And regardless of the diet that you're choosing to follow, protein needs to be at the heart of it. If you're choosing to follow a plant-based diet, fine. If you're choosing to be vegetarian, fine. If you're choosing to be vegan, fine. I still need you to get enough protein. That's not an excuse to all of a sudden be like a carb bunny. You can't do that. It's not going to work.
Yeah. And that's been a great help for me, even with Zoe, with my daughter, right? Making sure that she is getting enough protein in different ways. So thank you for that. And just before I open up to questions, I do want to mention one more thing, because Dr. Corradetti has another superpower that I love. She does facial rejuvenation for her clients, which is acupuncture. And I am addicted to it. I absolutely love it. Yes, Tosca, exactly. Because it sounds a little scary because it is acupuncture in your face, but it is the most relaxing Zen. Like, I can see her for an hour and I feel like I've been at a spa all day, just because it completely relaxes your body. So that's a hidden superpower that she has. And if anyone's interested, Rachel, maybe I can get you to put your contact in the chat so that everybody has that.
Yeah.
And so whether it's, regarding your hormones, looking to, have just a really good balanced naturopathic approach to, how we take care of ourselves, or if you're interested in facial rejuvenation, like, she gets a +10 rating from me. So thank you for that.
Yeah,
so let's open up to questions.
Yeah.
So yes, I see Tosca's got her hand up there, and I think Mackenzie had a question, and I know Karen had a question. So let's, Tosca, do you want to lead us on this one?
Sure. So Rachel, thanks for all that information about protein. You know that I'm the queen of protein, so I'm 100% there. But I just want to clarify your quote. You said 1 gram per kilogram of body weight. Is that per day?
Yes, per day.
Or per meal?
No,
Per day.
per day.
Okay, got
1
it.
gram
Thanks.
per
I just
kilogram
wanted
of
to
body
be,
weight. That's like your daily goal that you should be trying to achieve, and that's at minimum. In some cases, in some cases we
So,
need you to have more, but generally when I throw that number out there and, you know, women will do a quick calculation, they're like, oh, I'm not getting that.
Well, because you think it's a lot, but what I've learned from you and Tosca is you can get the protein in lots of different ways, right? And so that adds up actually quicker, because I was that person. I was like, oh my gosh, Rachel, I can't have that much protein. Like that's just not even doable for me. And but it is doable, and I have been doing it. And the thing is too, when you eat more protein, then you're not hungry. So you're not wanting to do the snacking. Like I have to actually make myself go and have something sometimes, because it's like I'm not hungry, but I know that I need to do it to keep everything working the way that it should be working.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. And Karen, okay, so Karen, do you want to say your question out loud, or do you want me to just read it?
Just go ahead and read it. That's fine.
Okay. So, and thank you for the question. So she says, how would you identify you are beginning to enter perimenopause? I have not had the opportunity to do any research on it on my own yet, and my cycles are already very irregular because I have PCOS.
Right. So good question. I will provide a personal share here. I'm 36 and I am beginning my perimenopause journey. I'm very young to be going through this, but I have a very low ovarian reserve. And so it's natural for me technically because of that. So I'll give you some examples of how I started to notice it for myself. Yes, irregular cycles can be a flag. If you have PCOS and your cycles are already irregular, then that might not be something that will give it away. So some of the symptoms that can start to develop with perimenopause, and the list is long. Like when I'm doing an intake with a patient that's more perimenopause focused, you know, are you having hot flashes? Are your breasts tender and swollen? Are you noticing thinning hair? Is your hair becoming dry? Is your libido tanking? Are you able to have an orgasm? Are you vaginally dry? Do your joints hurt? These are some of the things, like it's a lot, right? And so many other things can mask as a perimenopause experience that it can be hard to tease it out sometime. So there's that, you know, going back to the idea of tracking your symptoms and seeing what's going on, and then working with someone to help put the pieces together. Generally, from a lab perspective, if we're doing some blood work, FSH is one of the hormones that we will investigate, follicle stimulating hormone. It's a pituitary gland hormone that works to stimulate the ovary to have a follicle mature that can be ovulated. When that number starts climbing and we're starting to see it go past, like these are Canadian numbers, but like the 10 mark, you know, getting 12, getting higher, that tells us what we're getting into that transitional time. So that's a way we can like actually, you know, look at it on testing, on lab values.
Awesome. Yeah, great question, Karen. Thank you. And then Tuesday asked, if I eat meat for my protein, does it need to be lean meat or some fat is okay? It's a good question.
That's a good question. This very much comes back to the conversation around meat quality and where you're sourcing it from. So I know that, you know, we hear a lot out there about choosing free range options, you know, meat products where we know that the animals have been treated in a humane way, where they haven't been exposed to a lot of toxins or hormones. That, you know, in that sort of situation, I would be more comfortable with you having a fattier meat choice. Toxins like to collect themselves in fatty tissue. So if you're having a meat product that is fattier and it's coming from, you know, poor quality meat or a poor quality animal, then you might be exposing yourself to toxins that we don't really want you to get. This is a whole other conversation that we could have, but the impact that environmental and social toxins that those have on our hormone experience is remarkable. In my work in fertility, we've seen a drastic decline in the last 50 years in the quality of sperm. And we are tying a lot of that to environmental and social toxin exposure. So, and it impacts women quite intensely as well. The top three that we get concerned about are parabens, phthalates, and BPA. So those are some things to be aware of in your life. If you want a great resource, there's a woman named Emma Roman, and she has online, she's Green at Home, and she is just a wealth of information on the toxin side of things. So if you're choosing a higher quality meat, it can be a little bit fattier. I don't mind that so much. Otherwise, I would stick with the lean choice.
That's really good. So when you said that just now, where my head went, because you think about the obesity rates, right, across North America, and a lot of that stems from the toxins, and we're storing those toxins in our bodies, and which creates all of these issues, right? And so eating clean, I mean, that's a big deal. That is a really big deal.
And if you're wanting to be mindful with your dollars, always adhere to the Environmental Working Group's Clean 15 and Dirty Dozen produce checklist, which you can find online. And it'll give you a list of the cleanest 15 produce items, which you don't have to purchase organic, and the dirtiest dozen. And it's usually like Dirty Dozen Plus, like there are usually a few more than 12 in there, where you'll definitely want to be purchasing those as organic choices. So some of the top ones, almost the last couple of years, it's been consistently strawberries. So that as the dirtiest.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, I'm a little bit in my house. I'm very, when we're doing the grocery list, we one of our COVID, I guess like wins this year was we finally got into steady meal planning. And so we'll sit down and prepare the menu for the week, and we'll prepare our grocery list, and we'll, put our order in, so we don't even have to go to the store anymore. And I always, if my husband's doing the shopping, or the click and shop, I should say, I'll put berries only if organic. and the rule is, if the berries are more than $5, no, Rachel, you can't have them.
Those are some good rules though, right?
Yes.
Because you don't, because traditionally we think, oh, berries, fruit, it's good, right? I mean, it's natural, it's good. And we don't always think about the chemicals that are used, or, sorry, Mackenzie just asked, what was the website?
I'm gonna type it in.
Okay. So we're not always thinking about that, and that's a really great call out, right? Because it's making smart choices, and and again, it is a choice, but it's paying attention to what we are putting in our bodies. Clean 15, awesome. Okay. I love it. Okay. Any other questions from our audience before we begin to wrap up here? Just give it a quick.
I'll put Green at Home.
I have another one.
Yes, Tuesday, go.
Sorry.
No, don't.
I have 3 boys, so I know they still have their hormones. I know we were focusing on women, but 2 of them are going through the teenage phase and having skin problems. So I just want to see if, what I can do to help them go through that phase.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so I don't want to get too personal with your kids. So I'll speak to some of the concerns that can often come up with teenage males. So mood changes for sure can develop. Acne can sometimes be a problem. Athleticism. So sometimes I've seen, I don't work with a lot of teenage males, but colleagues who I have worked with them having difficulties with fatigue, with energy levels, with performance in their athletic abilities. And often that'll tie into mood as well. So it's really no different when we're speaking about teenage males and teenage and females, really teenage persons overall. No matter how you're choosing to identify yourself gender-wise, that you want to be looking at the basics, what's going on with your diet, what's going on with your athletics. And I shouldn't say athletics, that's not the word that I meant. I did a big workout this morning, and she was talking all about athletes. So that word's in my head right now. But so what's going on with diet, what's going on with physical activity, that's what I wanted to say. So movement, what's going on with sleep. Yeah, what's going on with that? Like what is going on the screens? So I have my mom's brother, one of her brothers lives in Michigan with his wife and their 2 sons. And one thing that I always found to be very remarkable about their choices with their teenagers is that there were absolutely no screens allowed in their bedrooms. So screens had to stay in an open space. And so that was in the kitchen. And, you know, this is like an N of 2 in this circumstance, but the difference that I see in those particular teenage boys compared to others is pretty remarkable. So that's another thing to consider.
I have a huge battle then to fight with the boys on this. I hope I can convince them.
The screens are so pervasive, but it's hard because they're living this whole other life that we just don't even know about, right? Yes. And what they're being exposed to on the screens and how that's impacting their hormones, how it's impacting their development, how it's impacting their brains, right? The levels of anxiety, especially with what's going on in the world, are just through the roof. Yeah. It's hard. So, you know, my children are young. My daughter is 4.5. My son is 2. I'm not quite there yet. I'm a little bit scared about it, I have to say, but I know personally that's one thing that like my husband and I agree on that we want to try to be as firm as possible when it comes to screens.
Well, it's true. And you're right, with COVID or pandemic, you know, it's because they're at home, they're at school online, their whole life right now, for the last 13 months, that's been their connection to the outside world. And so it is tough. Yeah. I just want to pick up a comment that Ivana had put in here, and she just talked about the confidence, right? Because with the periods and acne, because it's happening on their back, and I'm with you, Ivana, I have a 15-year-old, so same thing. And it does affect the confidence, right? Because it's the whole image and, you know, just totally. It's a tough time even being a teenager, but then add those complications to it. Yeah.
And I can relate. I was a teenager with acne. Mom, how many times did we go to the dermatologist? And I am no different than so many other people in this position where the choice that was given to me was the birth control pill. At the time, it was Diane 35. That was the most popular one. Thinking back to the fact that I took that scares the crap out of me, because I have since learned that I have a genetic blood clotting. It's basically a genetic SNP, we call it, where I have a higher tendency to blood clots. And that particular medication has been known to cause that in young people using it. Wow. So I'm like, I can't even, but I didn't know any better at the time, right? We just didn't really know. And so if those things are developing, we have to be aware of the fact that depending on the age of the person going through these menstrual changes and the hormone changes, some of this is like a little bit normal in the sense that in those early years, you know, if you're in those like first like 3 years, there's a lot going on with the body, and the body's just trying to figure itself out. It's not different from, you know, being on the other side of it where we're transitioning out. That's almost like a second puberty, really, in a way. Like one we're ramping up, the other we're ramping down, and it's like not a fun experience. So, you know, if they're quite a bit younger and they're new to their menstrual experience, then we might not be as harshly investigating what could be going on, and we're going to turn right back to the basics. So what can we do with dietary changes? Are there things in particular in the diet that are making acne worse? So, you know, we do actually have clinical research to suggest in some cases that dairy will make acne worse. It's not always the case, and I'm certainly not someone who knocks on dairy. Some people will have no problem with it whatsoever, but we do have some clinical research to suggest that it will actually elevate androgen levels. Androgens, again, are more of those male pattern hormones. And so, you know, if we're starting to see the development of acne on the back, along the jawline, in young women, that can sometimes suggest that we've got a little bit of an elevation with those androgen levels, and we might need to kind of try to scale it back with the dairy products. That's one thing. If they're older and they've been menstruating for a longer time, we might want to do a little bit more investigation into what's going on with those hormone levels, and if we need to be sort of trying to like balance that out a little bit. Are they a little bit estrogen dominant? You know, do we need to try to reduce that? Think about the toxin exposure, because BPAs in particular, that's an endocrine mimicker that will actually make you look more estrogen dominant. Phthalates are problematic, parabens, like I mentioned. So circle back to those, like the real basic stuff. What's going on with diet? What's going on with your toxin exposure? What's your exercise like? What's your water intake like? What's going on also with the sleep, the basics. I'm saying it over and over again. I wish I had a magical pill, and sometimes I do. Sometimes I do, but you know, I'm not really treating anybody here on this call because you're not necessarily my patients. So this is like the basics. If you're going to start to want to treat things, then you'll want to have some support on that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to reference what Karen had just shared. She talked about birth control, like when she went on birth control, you know, had no idea what the long-term impact would be. And because her PCOS wasn't diagnosed until her 30s, the birth control pills actually masked it. And I think that's true with any, whether it's vaccines, whether it's pills, whether it's, you know, there are other complications that can occur. And so it is knowing and having that, you know, being aware of what we've put into our bodies and what the impact can be.
Yeah. And I like what Mackenzie has mentioned here about like potentially being on an oral contraceptive medication or another type of birth control medication for 10 plus years. So circling back to that, we will sometimes ask patients to consider it. And this is not something that I can prescribe, but I will have these conversations with my patients because they're using these things. Is it the type of thing where maybe we can harness the medication's properties for contraceptive purposes, for example, for a couple of years? So we can get you through like a little bit of a difficult time. And then okay, you're going to come off of it. So Lisa Hendrickson-Jack, who I mentioned, her book, The Fifth Vital Sign, she has a whole chapter on oral contraceptive medication. And she actually has a section in there where she talks about why it should have a black box warning on it because of all the side effects that it can cause for people who are using it. So suicidal ideations, increased risk of HPV infection, vaginal dryness, decreased libido, et cetera, et cetera. And so that would be a really great resource if you're considering that, or if you're in that place where you're having to make a decision about oral contraceptive medication. Same with Aviva Ram. Dr. Aviva Ram is a medical doctor in the United States who speaks quite a bit about that. Bye, Mom. Sorry.
No, that was great.
Too much. I could talk about this stuff all day.
No, this was fabulous. And Tosca, thanks for coming today.
Thank you. God bless. Thanks so much for everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too. So just Dr. Corradetti, just thank you so much for being here. You know, this has been amazing. We've covered, I know there's so much more, like we could spend hours literally talking about this, but so much great information that you've shared. And thank you so much. And to our guests that are here today, thank you all for joining us and for your great questions. And you know, you'll get the recording as well. And if you know somebody who's struggling with hormones, like share this information with them, you know, because the more we inform and it's that community, like you talked about, Dr. Corradetti, just making sure that we're reaching out to others to, you know, just share information. Yeah. But you've been a pleasure. Thank you so much. And just everybody, wishing you the best. And thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much, everybody. Nice to meet all of you.
Thank you for everything. This was amazing.
You're most welcome. Have a great day.
Bye.
Sunshine. Bye.
Is it just the two of us? Let's see.
Just